I'm Spencer Bailey. This is Time Sensitive. Hey everyone, on this week's episode, I'm joined in the studio by the Los Angeles-based novelist Viet Thanh Nguyen. He's also the chair of English and a professor of English and American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. Since winning the Pulitzer Prize in 2016 for his novel The Sympathizer, which last month debuted in the form of an HBO miniseries of the same name starring Robert Downey Jr. and Hoa Xuande, Viet has become an internationally known voice on matters such as anti-Asian hate, refugees and immigrants, war and genocide, and memory and memorials, particularly what he calls the industries of memory and the ethics of remembering. In demand as an op-ed writer, speaker, and, though I'm sure he'd cringe at me saying this, media personality, Viet is also the author of many books, including the recent A Man of Two Faces, a memoir, a history, a memorial, as well as The Committed, the follow-up novel to The Sympathizer, the nonfiction book Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, and two children's books, Chicken of the Sea, which he co-authored with his son Ellison, and the just-published Simone. At this particular moment in time, there's no one I'd rather speak to about America's cultural divisions. Viet is at once serious, level-headed, and incredibly rigorous in his logic and thinking, yet also playful and, at various turns, downright funny. As someone deeply interested and engaged in memory studies and memorial culture, I was really moved by our conversation, which I opened with an unforgettable F. Scott Fitzgerald quote that I didn't know about until I read A Man of Two Faces, and that I think is really essential for navigating this bifurcated moment we're in worldwide. I'll leave it there for now. Before we get into the episode, I'd first like to thank our Season 9 presenting sponsor, L'École, School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison Van Cleef and Arpels. With the mission of sharing the art and culture of jewelry with the general public, L'École's offerings range from classes on art history and introductory jewelry making to public lectures and talks, from books and exhibitions to a brand new podcast, Voice of Jewels. Since establishing its first campus in Paris in 2012 and a second in Hong Kong in 2019, L'École recently opened campuses in Shanghai and Dubai. Housed in the twin villas on Middle Huaihai Road and spread over nearly 22,000 square feet, the Shanghai School is the largest school of jewelry arts in the world. It offers free exhibitions as well as classes and in-person lectures by art historians, gemologists, jewelers, and craftspeople. The Shanghai campus's inaugural exhibition featured a collection of men's rings, while the Dubai campus opened with an exhibition unearthing the history and lore of the emerald. You can learn more about L'École and its current and upcoming offerings at www.l'ecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.LECOLEVANCLEEFARPELS.com. And now, here's my conversation with Viet. Hi, Viet. Welcome to Time Sensitive.
Hi, Spencer. Thanks for having me.
I thought we'd start today on one particular moment in time, and then we'll get to the current moment, but October 20th, 2023. I bring this up because I interviewed the novelist Min Jin Lee that morning for this podcast, and you were scheduled to appear at the 92nd Street Y with her that night. Obviously, as news reports soon after shared, the event was canceled, and you did end up doing a talk, but just not at the 92nd Street Y. So now that a little more than 6 months has passed, you've probably had a little bit of time to reflect on this. How are you thinking about that particular day and moment?
That was one of the most stressful moments of my life, and probably the most stressful moment of my authorial life. Min and I had some extensive conversations that afternoon or early evening trying to figure out what we were going to do and her concerns for my safety. It was the beginning of just a moment of intense, I think, moral and political an artistic testing for me, which I appreciate in retrospect. It's certainly something that I wouldn't have chosen, but it was a consequence of things that I did choose to do, which, immediately preceding October 20th was to sign a ceasefire letter along with 700 or so other writers, a letter that I think in retrospect was very, very moderate in the tone that it took and what it was asking for in terms of a ceasefire, things that I think would not be very controversial right now, but in the wake of October 7th was quite controversial. So, with the passage of time, I think that, as I said at that moment, I have no regrets over anything I've said or done regarding Israel, Palestine, Gaza, the war, ceasefire, and everything related to that. But, I see myself as a writer who deeply believes in art and beauty, but also in truth and commitment. That's the kind of genealogy of writing that I come out of. And so that was a real test for me. And I'm actually grateful that I had that opportunity.
You write a bit about F. Scott Fitzgerald in your new book, and there's a quote there that you've referenced that I wanted to pull up because I wasn't familiar with it, and it's so great, and it connects to this, which is, the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function.
It's a beautiful quote. It's one of my favorites from F. Scott Fitzgerald because I think he's right. We're not unique in that we live in times in which there are radically diametrical political beliefs in operation at the moment. And sometimes two things can be true simultaneously. And there's no simple or easy resolution, no matter what some politicians or leaders or friends might want to tell us. And so we have to dive right into the murkiness and the conflict. It's not very pleasant, obviously. But for people who work in ideas as artists or as intellectuals, as teachers, hopefully as university administrators, that's exactly what we should be grappling with. That's what we do with our lives and our work. Again, I would rather just spend my time sitting in my nice office, writing up my nice novel. But the friction that Fitzgerald indicates, that uncomfortable friction, that's actually where I think really provocative work comes from.
Yeah, contradiction too.
Yes.
Bringing this into this very moment, it's a really exciting time for you. Just 3 nights ago, you made your on-screen debut in The Sympathizer, the HBO miniseries adaptation of your 2015 novel of the same name, of which you're an executive producer. What was it like for you to enter the world of HBO and Hollywood in this way and on screen?
It's really interesting because I live in the world of books and I love books and so do all my friends. But honestly, even my friends who are writers and professors and so on, they were so excited about this TV show. Congratulations on the TV series. I've gotten so many more congratulations and excitement than I had upon publishing the book itself. So it just illustrates the world of entertainment, ideas, and media that we live in which what I care about the most, which is writing and ideas and novels, is still quite secondary for most people, even to those people working in these spheres, to television and entertainment and movies and this entire spectacle. And I'm seduced by it too, because it is a lot of fun to go hang out and have a private lunch with Robert Downey Jr., for example, or do a photo shoot with Sandra Oh. These are incredible opportunities, and I'm enjoying them greatly. And I think of it all in the same way that the Fitzgerald quote that we just talked about, that this is the reality we live in, so I want to operate in it so that my ideas can be leveraged and transmitted out through a different medium that will reach a different audience and maybe a larger audience. And yet at the same time, I also recognize that it's also just entertainment.
And Hollywood is something you write a lot about in the memoir, A Man of Two Faces, which came out last year, which I should clarify is as much a memoir as it is a book of history and a memorial. And it gets into this Hollywood mythologizing. So I imagine this HBO experience has been particularly heady in light of that. In the book, you note the, quote, hypnotic power of Hollywood, which fairly, I think, you call America's unofficial ministry of propaganda. And elsewhere, you note several classic Hollywood films, particularly related to their depictions of Vietnam, Casualties of War, Apocalypse Now, Platoon, and The Deer Hunter. I should also add that you're authoring much of this book in the second person. There's a quote here I wanted to bring up, which is, "You are determined against the dehumanizing force of Hollywood and its drive of representation against Vietnamese people to humanize the Vietnamese and give them a voice." Long-winded question, but now that you've had The Sympathizer find its way to HBO. How are you thinking about this evolution and time span from the 20 years it took to publish your first novel, the 2 years it took to write it, and now this HBO show, in light of, I guess, that quote I just mentioned?
I think about the fact that when it comes to being a writer, the only thing that's really required for a writer is the writer's life. And no one cares about the writer's life, so that costs nothing except to the writer. Whereas a TV show of this scale that we're talking about is at least $100 million. Now everybody cares because it's $100 million. And so the project of dehumanization and humanization is really complicated when you look at it in that landscape, because I think the dehumanization is real. I was deeply affected by watching America's movies about the Vietnam War. I felt that we as Vietnamese people were dehumanized in so many different ways. And I think that most of the world didn't recognize that dehumanization. Most of the world who saw these movies just accepted them as stories or as entertainment or as spectacles. We didn't matter for most of the world in that. So the necessity to humanize and to seize whatever methods we can to tell our stories is really actually pretty important. At the same time, of course, now that it's taking place, I can also very easily say that that humanization is still trapped or working through this gigantic corporate mechanism with all kinds of its own contradiction and its own complications. So I think the book itself and my work in a larger way complicates even that desire for humanization. Because I do ask the question, I think in the book and elsewhere, well, what does it mean to be human? Why do we have to prove our humanity? And what about the complexities of humanity? Most people are so eager to claim their humanity and not recognize the inhumanity within themselves or their friends or their collectivities, their nations. That's really where the larger project goes towards.
And in a way, it's funny because it makes me think, hearing you say all this, of this New York Times review that came out following the publication of The Sympathizer, where, and I'm going to paraphrase, I'm probably not getting this exactly right, the reviewer wrote that you are giving voice to the voiceless. Keeping that in mind, I guess, how do you think about that notion? Obviously, I've heard you write and speak about this idea of voicelessness, and you do write about it in the book. But how do you think about that in the context of Hollywood and this particular project?
There are narratives out there that are very easy to fall into. Let's all be human together, for example. Well, let's all get along. Who can dispute that? And giving voice to the voiceless. Who can dispute that? People still say it to me and to other people in my similar situation. Thank you for speaking up. You're giving voice to people whose voices can't be heard, which is actually probably more accurate than the voiceless. I like to quote Arundhati Roy, who says, "There's no such thing as the voiceless. There is only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard." And that's much more accurate. We have to draw attention to the fact that in order for someone like me to speak, all these other people have to be silenced. There's an agency, there's an action taking place. And so I distrust anybody who willingly embraces that idea that they're going to be a voice for the voiceless, or the people who celebrate that kind of thing without acknowledging that these voices wouldn't exist without condemning all of these unknown numbers and masses of people to conditions where no matter how loud they shout, they can't be heard. And I grew up in a refugee community surrounded by really loud Vietnamese people. They definitely had voices. And if you lived within the Vietnamese community, you heard them all the time. And so even if we talk about a country like the United States, I think we have to recognize there are some voices that are much, much louder than others. They get the platform, they get the megaphone and all of that. And then there are all of these diverse populations having all of these conversations within themselves that can't be heard on the larger stage. And that's where someone like me appears. And I have to be very conscious of that dynamic so that I'm not naive when I say words like the human or voice. I can't be naive and think that just because my story has been told that, oh, we've solved the problems that I'm talking about. We haven't. And so I think of myself as a writer who both wants to tell his story, but also draw attention to what I call the conditions of voicelessness that have to be abolished.
It makes me think about the importance of what it means to have a voice. Whose voice? And in the case of your voice, obviously you win the Pulitzer Prize and then kind of catapulted up to being a, quote, thought leader or whatever.
Oh, don't call me that.
I said, quote.
Influencer, thought leader. Yeah.
But yeah, put on that sort of pedestal or platform and How did you contend with that, going from a very respected professor, but maybe not a household name?
When I was in school at Berkeley as an undergraduate and a graduate, the writers and intellectuals I admired were what we at the time called organic intellectuals. Writers who, did believe in art and beauty and all that, as I said, but also believed in writing from very particular historical conditions about particular political revolts, and who attached themselves to social and political movements in addition to artistic movements. So, in fact, I think I was always working in that vein, even as an undergraduate. I didn't want to call myself an organic intellectual. That to me was as pretentious as thought leader or influencer. It's not something that one should claim. That's really the title that people should give to you, whether you like it or not. So it was always something that I wanted to do, and I think my career was dedicated to it. Winning the Pulitzer Prize just amplified that situation, but it wasn't as if it changed what I was saying or who I was. I simply took advantage of what we now call a brand or a platform. Again, terms I really object to. But this is the terrain in which something like a prize or a publication or a TV series happens. This is not up to me. This is the entire media apparatus of attention and celebrity and amplification that takes place. I am very wary of it, but I also recognize I have opportunities to use other people's perceptions in order to get my point across. So people who invite me to things and say, we want you to be provocative, should be a little bit careful about what they think of in terms of provocation, because I'll try to seize that opportunity.
Connected to this, you have written about how majority populations live in, and I love this phrase, a luxury of narrative plenitude. This idea of narrative plenitude, whereas there are fewer stories of or about minority groups who, as you put it, dwell in narrative scarcity. This dichotomy between plenitude and scarcity, could you add to that a little bit and how you think about it through a time and memory and maybe even memorial perspective? Because I think you're a really interesting example of someone who's been able to kind of experience it firsthand, but also see the ups and the downsides of both the plenitude and the scarcity.
When you live in narrative scarcity, almost none of the stories are about you and people like you. And of course, that means you and your people like you put enormous burdens on stories that appear that are about you or people like you. And it's an unfair burden, right? But the way that time, I think, and memory filter into this is because once you have this opportunity, if you live in narrative scarcity and then you have the opportunity to tell your story, and I'm putting quotation marks around that, then time often comes in because the writer or the artist oftentimes feels an obligation to the community that they come from, to memorialize that community, to think nostalgically, and that's about time, to think back on what their parents and grandparents or their ancestors had gone through. And so that's all very crucial. But it can lead to an art that is invested in sanctification. That's when the nostalgia part becomes problematic. Because, of course, we should love and respect our ancestors and our elders and so on. But they were people, and as are we. And as I mentioned earlier, that means we're human and inhuman, which means they were very imperfect people, almost by definition. So that's the contradiction that narrative scarcity produces, the desire to tell very necessary stories, but then also the desire to, whitewash or homogenize these stories in certain ways. And what plenitude means for me is to create conditions where we don't have to worry. We don't have that anxiety about having to pretend that there aren't these imperfections, these flaws, these even evils that have existed within our people, our community, whoever we're telling stories about. That's not just a luxury. That's a real source of power to be able to think in that way and to create in that way.
Yeah, and story is time in that sense. And the time we give to story, I think really can be you hear people talk a lot about time scarcity. We don't hear people talk about story scarcity so much, narrative scarcity. So I think that that's actually really a compelling thing to think about if we give more time to the narratives that don't get enough time, what might happen.
Time operates in many different ways. I mean, there's certainly time as in attention, what you're talking about, right? We have a finite amount of time, and we have to decide which books we're going to read, which shows we're going to watch, and so on. I'm quite aware of this because I'm looking fairly closely at the reception of the Sympathizer, not just in terms of what does Time magazine think of it, or these professional reviewers, but what's Twitter saying? What's Reddit saying? And, there are a lot of comments where people are like, well, I don't know. I mean, I just watched Shogun. Maybe I should watch Fallout. Maybe I should watch Ripley. So people are already debating, like, with a finite amount of time, which TV series are they going to watch? What are their priorities going to be? And that's a complicated set of criteria that people are bringing to it. But the other aspect of time, I think, is the time of the creator, the person or the people who make something. And in order to have that time, that's also a luxury. My parents, when I was growing up, they worked in a grocery store, or they owned a grocery store, and they had no time because all their time was being sucked up into survival, into running this grocery store. They had no time to read. On their luxury time, what do? They watch like crappy TV series like Shogun and Thornbirds, things like this. And so I grew up with the sense that to be a writer, to have the time to be a writer, or to be a student, to be a scholar, to have time to think, to have time to work with ideas, to do podcasts, that requires luxury because you have the time. You're not worried, I don't know about you, but I'm not worried about whether or not I will survive in this country. That's not a concern. I mean, I have more mundane concerns than that. So that sense of, for a writer, that time is a luxury that other people are paying for with their lives or their time, that is something that I think a lot of us who come from these kinds of conditions where we're very aware of the sacrifices of the people around us, that conditions how, at least I think of myself as a writer. And oftentimes there's a feeling of guilt and obligation because I recognize, and people like me recognize, we wouldn't have the luxury of time if other people hadn't sacrificed for it. Therefore, we better make some really good use of this time that is given to us as a privilege by other people's sacrifice.
Beautifully put. And on the subject of time, in your new memoir, there's this paragraph. It's a stanza, really. And I should say here that would you call it poetry? There's definitely a poetic sensibility to the book and the way that you've arranged it. And it gets at what it was like, or what it is like, to be a refugee through a time lens. I wanted to read it here. Being a refugee always involves time traveling from one country in one time to another country in another time. And most of all, living in the present while feeling the past, always lurking, always haunting.
Let me give you an example of that. I'm a refugee from the war in Vietnam, my entire family is, and in the chaos of 1975, of March and April, and we just, April 30th was just yesterday in our conversation. That was the end of the fall of Saigon. My family fled and we left behind my sister. I wouldn't see her for 27 or 28 years. Until I went back to Vietnam. And then after that, I didn't see her again for 20 more years until she came last month to visit me and my family here.
Wow.
And that was her first visit to the United States, first visit to LA, first visit to Hollywood. And she timed it perfectly because I was able to take her to the premiere of the TV show, and she got to have her picture taken with all these movie stars and everything. She loved it. But that's time. Because my brother came also to participate in the premiere. And when he met my sister, that was the first time they'd seen each other in 49 years. So I'm always aware of time. I'm always aware of, how history has shaped my time, both as a writer, but also as someone who my consciousness, my thinking, my emotions have been shaped by this sense of multiple times that exist. The time that my sister went through, that could have been my time if I'd been left behind. And her life went in a completely different direction versus me. So time is relative. And I'm always, cognizant that my time is paralleled by other people's times, such as my sister's, that are real, but also the possibility of alternate realities, parallel universes where my time would have been completely different. And so I am haunted by that, not haunted just by the past, but haunted by the consequences of the past in the present in terms of alternate possibilities of my own life.
Hey everyone, taking a quick break here to tell you a little bit about our Season 9 presenting sponsor, L'École, School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison Van Cleef and Arpels. In addition to its courses, lectures, publications, and other programming, L'École also has a new podcast, Voice of Jewels, which draws on knowledge from its lecturers, researchers, and other experts to uncover the stories and secrets behind history's most fascinating jewels. The first 2 seasons, titled Sentimental Jewels and The Blue Diamond's 1001 Lives, are now available on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Upcoming seasons will explore the themes of gold, comics, talismans, and pearls. You can learn more about Nicole and Voice of Jewels at www.nicolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.LeColevancleefarpels.com. And now, back to the episode. And this in-betweenness isn't just about being between two nations, it's being between different times as well. And you've talked about this experience as sort of a terrifying void between nations. There's the Netherland between here and there, and this is sort of a central theme, I would say, across most of, if not all of your work. Like in The Sympathizer, there's a moment where the narrator goes, "When I reminded him that I did not belong here, he said, 'You don't belong in America either.' Perhaps," I said, "but I wasn't born there. I was born here."
Yeah, I think about how when I went back to Vietnam, I would meet these men who work there as businessmen from Korea and Taiwan. They had a nostalgic sense of Vietnam at the time, it was early 2000s. And for them, it was about time. They were thinking, wow, Vietnam of the early 2000s looks like Korea from 20 years ago or Japan from 20 years ago. So they had a sense of time that was different as well. And by that, I mean what they were sort of signaling to me was that the interruption of war and colonization had shaped the times of these nations differently, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and so on. If war hadn't intervened in Vietnam, it would have been just like Korea. That's what they were saying. That's what they were implying. So there's already a sense in which historical intervention transforms the times of the nations. You know, if you think about time as developmental, as these businessmen were thinking, I mean, their thinking was if war hadn't interrupted Vietnam, it would be just as capitalist as we are today, and it will be as capitalist if we just give the country time. And in the example from the book that you read, I mean, I think that narrator of that novel, who is not me, but who shares some emotional similarities to me, is a man out of step, out of time. He's thinking in a different time register than a lot of other people. He's thinking about revolutionary time. He understands how time operates in both Vietnam and the United States. And it's like that Fitzgerald idea. Everybody wants to be in step. If you're in step, you're in the same time as the people you're walking with. But if you have two ideas in your head, you have two beats going on. How do you walk to that? How do you step? How do you be in tune, in time with everybody else around you? And so that's what it means to be out of time, out of sync, if you're aware of different historical possibilities and realities that your fellows around you may not be aware of.
I mean, it really makes me think of the title of the book, A Man of Two Faces, A Man of Two Times, in a sense. And that title comes from this line at the beginning of The Sympathizer. It's on page 1. You sort of alluded to it, that you're not the narrator, but there are connection points. Could you go a little further there?
The opening line of The Sympathizer is, "I'm a spy, a sleeper, a spook, a man of two faces. And perhaps I'm also a man of two minds," something like that. Yeah, so I was growing up as this refugee, and in my parents' very Vietnamese household, I felt like an American. That's what I was exposed to in terms of popular culture and literature and so on. But when I stepped out of my parents' Vietnamese household into the rest of the United States, I felt like a Vietnamese person spying on Americans. And I think that's actually a very common experience for someone who is a so-called minority, refugee, immigrant, outsider, to have that experience of at least two faces, two times, two spaces. You know, you're trying to be in sync with these two communities. And if you are doing that, you're always going to be out of sync at the same time. Again, that's a very normal experience. I felt that, you know, when I was 25 or 30 or 40 trying to be a writer, that why would I want to write about that? Because it's so boring. But I took that feeling and I put it into the body of the spy who's in The Sympathizer and amplified it drastically. And then after all of that, I think I realized, in fact, as banal as my feelings are, as quotidian as my existence is, the job of a writer is actually to investigate not only the dramatic and the spectacular, but the banal and the quotidian, and to find the human and the universal in that. that was one of the impetuses for writing A Man of Two Faces, is for me to go back and to interrogate what seems so banal and so quotidian, but actually is deeply terrifying to me. And I think that one of the points of writing a memoir is to understand that to write a good memoir, you have to expose yourself. You have to go into the part of yourself, whatever that is so terrifying that you don't want anybody else to know about it. You may not even want yourself to know about it, even if you're just a banal, looking person on the outside. And I think that exists for a lot of us, and at least it does for me. In order for me to access that, I had to start writing A Man of Two Faces with a pretense, which is that I wasn't writing about myself. I was the sympathizer writing about me. So I created this character. I wrote through him for at least 800 pages now in 2 books. And then I turned his perspective back on me, the creator, in order to excavate myself.
Fascinating. I mean, we could probably also have an hour-long conversation about the subject of memory alone.
Well, memory is related to time.
Yeah. And personally, I find your use of language around memory to be profound. As I was reading your book, I kept underlining many of your phrases, such as the lost detritus of our past, a flickering single frame of memory, another Polaroid of memory, that marrow of memory. And I took particular note of this one line. Through the windows of my sandcastle of memory, I can hear the ocean of amnesia, perpetual, invincible. This is probably a very tricky and even slippery question, but how do you approach thinking about this intersection of time and memory, or even time and memorial in your life and work?
Time and memory are definitely related and inextricable. And I think the challenge for anyone who thinks about memory, whether it's in a scholarly, artistic way, or even simply reflecting on one's own life, is to realize that time inevitably changes memory. I don't know of a way of escaping that conundrum, because memory is not stable. Facts may or may not be stable, but memory is definitely not stable. And we narrate facts in retrospect through our ever-changing memories. And I'll give you an example that comes directly out of this book. The genesis for this book is that I took a writing class when I was a college student, and I wrote an essay for that, which was about my mother going to a psychiatric facility, which is obviously devastating for her, but also traumatic for me. And I wrote that essay when I was 19, and I put it into a box, and I didn't look at it again for 30 years. And I only opened it during the pandemic, to start investigating myself. And I just certainly did not forget over those 30 years that my mother had gone to a psychiatric facility. What I thought I remembered was that she had gone when I was a little boy. I opened the essay, read it a couple of years ago, and realized that I was 19 when I wrote that essay, and my mother had gone to a psychiatric facility when I was 18. So it was only the year before. And somehow, even as a full-grown adult, my memory had changed the facts. And if I hadn't written that essay, I wouldn't have the facts as I saw them at that time. But the indisputable fact that it was when I was 18, not when I was a little boy. So whether my memory was a part of me or not a part of me, it had changed these facts in order to, I think, better express how I felt that this was so traumatic that I was reduced to childhood in the face of watching what was happening to my mother. Time itself had been changed in my remembering, but time had probably also affected my way of remembering simultaneously. And that basic paradox, I think, is something that we live constantly. We're always changing the facts of our past to better suit our present.
Could you share your earliest memory?
My earliest memory was when I came to the United States. I was 4 years old as a refugee with my parents, and we ended up in a refugee camp in Pennsylvania. And in order to leave that refugee camp, you needed a sponsor. But there was no sponsor willing to take all 4 of us. So one sponsor took my parents, one sponsor took my 10-year-old brother, one sponsor took 4-year-old me. So my first memories were of howling and screaming as I was being taken away from my parents, which was being done for benevolent reasons. But when you're 4, you don't really obviously understand that. And what was interesting about that is, I came home after a few months, and then we all had to get on with our lives. We all had to try to survive in the United States. We all had to look forward, and yet we were, I think, always being pulled into the past. That Fitzgerald quote, another one from The Great Gatsby,
Yes.
where just boats beating forward but being borne ceaselessly back into the past. And I think that was true for a lot of refugees. We all had to move forward to survive economically, but so many of us were being pulled back into the past at the same time. So there was always that tension between the forward and the backward. And in regards to that particular memory of being 4 years of age, I certainly never forgot it, but I also felt that in a teleological sense of time, that I had moved beyond it, that it was all in the past. And then when my son turned 4 in 2017, it was the moment when the Trump administration was enacting a border policy where children were being separated from their parents and being put into cages and being lost in the system. And I was very upset and angry about that, partly out of my own political convictions, but then also out of my own memory of what had happened to me. And looking at my son at 4 years of age, it just propelled me right back into the past. And for the first time in, at that point, 40 years or so, 40 plus years, I looked back on myself as that 4-year-old boy and had greater empathy for him and what he had gone through. And I had greater empathy for my parents, which I never thought about before. I never thought about, well, what did my parents go through? And I realized, looking at my own 4-year-old son, I would never, under any circumstance, agree to having him taken away from me. So what was it like for my parents to have to agree to that? And so that was just a moment where, again, it was very clear to me that time was not linear, because I could already see ahead and see that those families at the border who had lost their children and the children themselves, they would never forget this moment. They would be scarred forever by this, and their entire lives would pivot around this moment. There was no moving beyond that for them, even as their lives obviously would move forward, hopefully in some way. And likewise, even though I'm moving forward in time, I'm aging, I'm dying, at the same time, I'm still that 4-year-old boy from back there as well.
Yeah, remind me, how long were you with this sponsor family?
Just a few months.
Yeah,
it felt like a long time when you're 4 years old.
Of course. I mean, you're at that age, and it's like, where's mom? Where's dad? You know? Wild. In 1978, your family moved from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania to San Jose. Obviously, quite a shift from central Pennsylvania to California. But looking back on it now, what are some instances or moments that come to mind for you when you think about your San Jose time?
Well, back then, the only thing people knew about San Jose was the song, Do You Know the Way to San Jose? And I just remember it as a time that was really wonderful in some ways, because I just spent all my time in the library reading books, escaping via stories. And that was a wonderful time where I lost track of time. I just had so much time to read books that I don't have anymore. So I think of it in a very utopian sense. But
you write that you were kidnapped by literature.
Right, exactly. And my poor parents, they were complicit in the kidnapping, because, I think their way of babysitting was, we're just going to drop them off at the library. And this is what they did, They would drop me off Saturday morning at the library before the doors even opened. I'd just be hanging out with a bunch of strangers outside. And then, that wasn't even the worst of it, because it was what's inside the library that was dangerous. My parents never realized that. They didn't think books were dangerous, but I was reading all kinds of things that really
tell me some of the dangerous books that you discovered.
Well, the most relevant for our purposes was A Portnoy's Complaint by Philip Roth, which, in the weird sense of time, he published that book in 1968. I probably read it in 1983. Only 25 years, right? That's, to me, it seemed like an ancient text, but it was only a 25-year-old book. The only thing I remember from that book was Alex Portnoy, this Jewish American adolescent who was so horny that he basically masturbated with anything he could get his hands on, culminating in a slab of liver from the family fridge, which he did his business, put it back in, and then his mom cooked it later that night for dinner. Then I thought, gross. Who eats liver for dinner? It's like, we do as Vietnamese refugees. So I totally felt this, sense of resonance with Alex Portnoy and his Jewish American experience, overshadowed by the horrible past and everything like that, which I felt was, in so many ways, a parallel to the Vietnamese refugee experience. And then, of course, I would never forget that moment, and I would pay homage to Philip Roth and Alex Portnoy in an episode in the novel, The Sympathizer, which, if you watch the TV series, episode 2, Park Chan-wook goes all the way, and he
sure does.
Puts that squid masturbation moment in there.
Don't eat it. Don't eat it.
Yeah, don't eat it. Yeah. Yeah, so that was a magical time in San Jose in the library. But it was magical because the flip side of it was the reason why I was there was because of this horribly difficult life my parents were leading, which they were trying to shelter me from, and which I was trying to close my eyes to, but I could still see it anyway. Their economic and personal struggle, which was so arduous for them. So that's what I remember about this decade in San Jose from 1978 until 1988 when I graduated from high school. And I just could not wait to leave San Jose. So that 10-year time span was that emotionally radioactive core of myself and memory that I think has still shaped me as a writer.
Hey everyone, taking another quick break here to tell you about our weekly newsletter, where I share a behind-the-scenes look into each time-sensitive episode and also get into various things in the cultural sphere that I'm paying attention to at the moment. You can sign up and join our 11,000 other subscribers by going to slowdown.media/newsletter. That's slowdown.media/newsletter. And now, back to the episode. I must mention your first job, too, at the hilariously named, at least in this context, Great America Amusement Park. You've written that to be an American is to be squeezed in the vice between these binaries of memorialization and murder. And when I think about this quote in the context of your job at the Great America Amusement Park, it's almost too good. Like, America as an amusement park in general is already a very good metaphor.
And the ironies abound because that whole amusement park was all full of roller coasters and things like that. But all the themes were around American history. So as we talk about time, here's this manufacturing of nostalgia through a handful of very flat tropes that people can consume while they're riding roller coasters. And I worked in an area of the park called Yankee Harbor. Okay, so that's all that needs to be said. And our uniform in Yankee Harbor was a pirate uniform or a sailor uniform. I don't know what it was, but black bell-bottom pants, a white shirt with a ruffled collar, and a tricorn hat. And most of us were like, young people of color, Filipinos, Vietnamese, this kind of thing. And so here we were manning Yankee Harbor. The ironies were just fabulous. And of course, the whole culmination of that is most of us got fired because we were breaking all the rules, riding these rides when we weren't supposed to in our uniforms, but riding these rides without our safety gear on because we were 16 or 17 and just basically idiots. So this one guy got into, I manned a ride called the Tidal Wave, which goes a roller coaster that goes into a big loop. So there's good reason why you want to have your safety restraints on. And this kid got in there without the lap bar on, so he had no restraints. I was like, what are you doing? And then he gets fired into the loop. He comes back and he jumps out and without having fallen to his death. And he says, centrifugal gravity. Centrifugal force, whatever. And I was like, oh, okay, we have a living demonstration of physics taking place here. I'm going to do that too. So I've never been so brave and so stupid in my entire life.
You made this choice in the book to title case America and include a trademark logo after it. You also redacted in black all mentions of the 45th president. Could you talk about these two particular editorial choices?
When we say the word America, I think time is implicit because, what's really implicit is timelessness. America, when Americans say it, but people all over the world as well. Maybe not in Latin and Central America, but people outside of that area. When people say America, there's this timelessness. It's a mythology, this idea of America and all of the various kinds of implications that we're all very familiar with. And I wanted to disrupt that easy sense of mythology and timelessness that hangs onto that word. And of course, the book talks about that history in various ways, but just at the level of the word, I wanted to stop readers from coming across that word and just sliding right over it as we normally do. That's why it's capitalized. That's why there's a trademark. So people have to pause. They go, well, why? Why is it capitalized? Why is it a trademark? And of course, for me, America is the ultimate embodiment of capitalism. There's also other things like
America.
America. But it's all around this idea that the New World was the genesis of a new world order based upon globalizing capitalism. And it didn't start in America, but it's certainly accelerated there. And we're still dealing with the consequences some 450 years after the first English settlers came to these shores. And I think of Donald Trump as a part of that history. I think of Obama as a part of that history too, and both of them come up in the book as symbolic faces in opposition to each other. America doesn't have just one face, it has two faces, just like me. And it's Donald Trump and Barack Obama in recent history. And of course, our ideological divides and divisions in this country are very binary at this moment. And these two presidents have come to symbolize this binary. And each side looks at the other in sheer shock and surprise. Like, how are you an American? And to me, that division goes back in time to the very origins of America trademark. Because on the one hand, I think it's true that this is a country of freedom and democracy. It's given me the opportunity to be a writer, which I could not have pursued in Vietnam in the way that I do now. Freedom and democracy for some. And at the same time, it's also a country that wouldn't have been possible without genocide, colonization, enslavement, warfare, slavery.
And as you point out, the Pilgrims were the original boat people.
They were the original boat people. They were just lucky the indigenous peoples didn't have cameras to take pictures of them. Because they were probably a pretty nasty looking bunch getting off of the little boats that they were in, right? But yeah, Donald Trump is in there because he is as American as they come, from the very origins of the country. And he embodies that America that is so self-reflexive that we don't even think twice about it. But so does Barack Obama. Those two mythologies operate simultaneously. And the reason I redacted Donald Trump's name, besides just maybe being petty, is because I was also thinking about how redaction is, to me, symbolic of self-censorship and the processes of memory. And we talked about how I redacted my own memory. But this country redacts its own memory. It's not to say that other countries don't. Every country does. But I'm an American talking about the United States. And the redaction becomes symbolic because I was also writing at a time when we have redacted documents that come out all the time about the various kinds of things that we're doing that are arguably either very American or very un-American, depending on your idea of what America is, what we do in Guantanamo, what we have done in our wars overseas, and so on. And so these official documents, we have them because we're a country of freedom of the press, and yet we redact all the things that would be quite bad for our image as Americans globally, but quite bad for our self-image to ourselves as Americans.
I love when artists and writers do this. Reginald Dwayne Betts, who's been a guest on this show, he has a series of redaction poems that are brilliant, relating to America's carceral system. Mm-hmm. Jenny Holzer, also the artist, she famously has done redaction artworks, and I think it's really effective. Again, it's another moment similar to the Capital America trademark. It does cause the reader to pause and reflect and say, oh. And a redaction is also a void, so there's this sort of void element, what's not there, what's not shown. I want to move forward a little bit to beyond your youth, to your Berkeley years, which you did mention briefly, but we didn't get to mention Maxine Hong Kingston, this incredible novelist who you got to study under and who wrote this note to you at the end of your course, basically encouraging you to seek counseling at the university counseling center. But that wasn't all she wrote in that note. And there's something I particularly loved, which is she wrote, "Questions are creative and dangerous. To ask a question is to be open to change." And I feel like those words, when I think about your work and what you've been able to do with your thinking and your seeing and your being and your writing, it connects so much to that notion of questioning. You're nodding, but how do you see it?
Absolutely. Yeah. Maxine, wise and wonderful writer and woman and teacher, got me. I mean, she saw me. She saw me falling asleep in her class every single day. That's why she thought I was alienated and depressed and needed help. And I, of course, did not think I was alienated and depressed and in need of help. I thought I was perfectly self-functioning and all of that. But there were warning signs. I started dating a young woman who would become my wife, and I told her, I'm pretty well adjusted. She said, "No, you're not." So she was right, as always. But it would take me becoming a writer instead of seeking counseling for me to try to figure out what was wrong with me. And part of what was wrong with me, and Maxine saw it right away, was that I was afraid to give of myself in my writing and also in my interactions with my fellow students and other human beings. And part of giving of oneself is to ask questions of oneself, to interrogate oneself, but ask questions of other people. I think we've all had that experience of talking to someone who only talks about themselves and they never ask you questions. It's a bad sign, right? And so I think that I've been fortunate to learn from my teachers, both in an intellectual sense, but also in a personal and emotional sense as well. So if we talk about time, I look back upon my 19-year-old self with great empathy, and there's a part of him that I want to retain, which is the anger, the passion, the conviction. We're at a moment where college students around the country are being arrested, beaten by police, and so on. Their futures are being threatened because they believe in something. Whether or not you agree with them, they believe in something, and they're really putting their bodies and their lives on the line. And I was like that when I was 19. I don't want to be 19 anymore because I think I was not a very good human being. I've spent 30 plus years trying to become a better human being through things like writing, interrogating myself, trying to figure out how to better access and deal with my emotions. But what was so important about remembering myself at that time was to try to retain the core of conviction. Because yes, adults can always say, well, those kids don't understand the complexities of this and that. It may be true, but what they do understand is that there are principles and they can detect hypocrisy. And to become an adult is partly about absorbing the rules of one's society so deeply that you can't see the hypocrisy that you accept as being normal. And these younger people, they can see that. And I could see that. And I admire myself at that time just for that, just as I admire the students of today. For doing what students should always be doing, which is reminding the adults of the absurdities, the hypocrisies, the oversights, the contradictions of our society that adults have learned to accept and students have not yet learned to accept.
Great transition, because I wanted to talk about youth and particularly these two children's books that you've worked on. This is like a total kind of left turn here, but it is connected. I mean, there's a sort of playfulness, and maybe we'll touch on this, a humor to your work, even though there's so much, serious stuff at play. And one of these books is Chicken of the Sea, which originated in the mind of your son, Ellison. And the second, Simone, comes out, I think, if my dates are right, 6 days from today. I imagine these kinds of projects are really generative for you in that way. I can imagine wading through the grief and trauma and memory stuff is tough. And having an outlet like this seems like a fun sort of way out. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, absolutely. Not to idealize childhood, but if one has a good childhood, part of what happens, I think, is that you have access to freedom and playfulness. And hopefully your parents and your environment are encouraging all of that. And that's something that I think most of us as adults have lost, that sense of a very different sense of time. Because, when you're a child, everything is infinite. Right? When you're an adult, your sense of time is closed down because you're counting the years until death. But when you're 4 or 5, hopefully you're not thinking about that very much. And you don't have the rules and the boundaries yet that will be imposed on you and that you will internalize. And so as I look at my children, I experience time through them. I experience trying to remember who I was when I was their age at any given moment. And then I think try to understand that their sense of time is vastly different than my sense of time. And that produces a different approach to the world. And I'm also trying not to idealize fatherhood or parenting. So a good number of people should not be parents, okay? But for those of us for whom it's been a positive experience, and for our children, it's positive in one way because it's reminded me to be playful. It's reminded me that rules are meant to be broken. That's really important for politics and for creativity. We talked about the student protesters. I think besides the very seriousness of what they're doing, they're also being playful. And I think that's what's also annoying to adults. Like, how dare you set up camps in the middle of the campus
provocative.
Quad? Yeah, right. So it is a sense of theater and play and spectacle in addition to very serious politics at the same time. That's what makes it fun. I've been to, my university's encampment. It seems like fun to me until the cops are called in and start arresting people. And that's like the adults coming in saying, no, you can't do this? How dare you break the rules? And for creativity, it's really important because in the world of adult writing, there are all these conventions that you know you're supposed to follow, both the conventions of the form, but also the conventions of the world in which writers work. You know, do you want to win that prize? You want to get that agent? You want to go to that dinner? You have to conform in various ways, whatever the world of publishing and writing is. And kids don't care about that. They don't care about that in terms of their rewards, and they don't care about that in terms of the books that they're reading or the art that they're looking at. And so it was really, I learned a lot from being a father to these kids in terms of trying to capture some of that creativity and unleash it in my own writing. And because ultimately, in the end, writing is not just art with a capital A, writing is play. And I think, you know, for me at least, it's a painful but also powerful way to try to make my way in the world and try to make a living is through this kind of paradox of serious playfulness.
Your children also connect to art across time because of their names. Ellison, named after Ralph Ellison, and Simone after Nina Simone.
And Simone de Beauvoir. And,
yeah.
You know, I mean, names are an opportunity, a challenge, a burden, and so on. You know, my name, Viet Thanh Nguyen, or Nguyen Thanh Viet in the original, it's as Vietnamese a name as you can get, you know, because the surname Nguyen is shared by about 40 million Vietnamese people, I think. And Viet, the first name, you know, it's a very common name. It's like being called George Washington or John Smith, you know, because Viet is the name of the people and Nguyen is the name of this gigantic part of the people. So I've always felt that burden of my name, so much so that when I became a citizen, my parents said, do you want to change your name? And I grew up in a household where I was told I was 100% Vietnamese. And then here are my parents becoming Joseph and Linda. I was like, what? What's going on? But I couldn't, they were so effective in teaching me, I couldn't change my name. So I understand the burden and the opportunity of naming. And so with my own children, they have Vietnamese middle names as well. But, you know, I wanted them to have names that would be opportunities and challenges for them once they understood who these people were that they were named after. Hopefully they won't resent me for giving them such explicitly symbolic names. Hopefully they'll see these names as an invitation to participate in history.
Final question, because we haven't talked about humor or laughter so much yet, I want to end on that. And there are these core components to your work and lines in the Sympathizer that made me chuckle. I mean, it's a war novel after all, but wartime is in and of itself an absurdity, and there should be somewhat, I think, an opportunity to laugh at the absurdity of it. And as you write in A Man of Two Faces, laughter could help the Vietnamese and the Americans recognize not only the idealism and valor of their holy revolutions, but the inevitable absurdity and hypocrisy, because nothing is so holy that the human species will not fuck it up.
I hope that's truth, you know, and I think about the fact that if we look back at World War II, for example, just from the American perspective, within like a decade, Hollywood was making comedies about World War II. This horrible experience, right? And yet we had Operation Petticoat, and I don't know, I grew up watching I was a male war bride. I grew up watching these kinds of comedies. And then, of course, we had Catch-22, which is a more serious comedy about World War II. And so for me, I read very serious books and watched very serious movies about war, but also watched these comedies and these satires. And I think they're all important registers for us to cope with this experience of war, because like every other human experience, war has all the emotional registers, whether we're talking about something in the past, like World War II, with a finite kind of time span, or whether we're talking about our reality as Americans today, where we're, I think, still living through forever war, as far as I can tell, perpetual war. It's a condition of that structures our daily lives as Americans, whether we are aware of it or not. And so it's not just one emotional register, it's many emotional registers that war operates on. And humor is really important because jokes not only help us survive by making us laugh, obviously, but jokes are a form of truth-telling. And I've actually learned quite a bit, not just from reading Joseph Heller and Catch-22, but also like watching stand-up comedians, because the good stand-up comedians have a sense of timing as they deliver the joke, but also a sense of timing in terms of knowing what time they live in and what function their jokes can serve. So in A Man of Two Faces, I quote Richard Pryor in 1975, talking about the arrival of these Vietnamese people as the new, you know what, to take the place on the American firing line instead of African Americans. That's a very painful joke for Richard Pryor to deliver. And it has so much truth in it and so much timing in it. I can't even replicate the joke for obvious reasons, but also because of the impeccable sense of timing that Pryor has to deliver that joke in that way, in that time. And so I've tried to learn a lot from comedians and stand-up comedians who are not just funny, but provocatively funny because their timing is on point.
I just watched the HBO special with Rami, and it's so of this moment. And so right now, in a way that I haven't seen a comedian do in a while.
Yeah. So you have to have the courage to have the time, right? I mean, he didn't have to make these jokes, but now it's the time. Now is his time. I'm looking forward to meeting him. He reached out to me.
Oh, great.
And so it's like, hey, we're back in the world of Hollywood now. So you can do both. You can be entertaining and you can be provocative at the same time.
I've quoted you a ton today, and I actually don't. I mean, sometimes I'll do quite a few quotes in an interview, but I feel like I've been quoting you with every question. There's one quote I wanted to leave our listeners with that I hope will linger in their minds, and it is, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Thanks, Viet.
Thanks so much, Spencer.
Extra thanks to our Season 9 presenting sponsor, L'École, School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison Van Cleef and our pals. A unique place for learning, L'École welcomes the general public to the world of jewelry through courses, talks, exhibitions, videos, books, and now, its Voice of Jewels podcast. You can find out more about L'École at www.l'ecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.LECOLEVANCLEEFARPELS.com. And thank you for listening. You can find more episodes of Time Sensitive on our website, timesensitive.fm, or wherever you listen to podcasts. To keep up with our latest Time Sensitive episodes and get behind-the-scenes updates, sign up for our newsletter at slowdown.media/newsletter. That's slowdown.media/newsletter. You can follow us on Instagram at slowdown.media. Our theme music was composed by Billy Martin. This episode was produced by Ramon Broza, Emily Jang, Mimi Hannon, Emily McDonald, and Johnny Simon.